The diner smelled of coffee and bacon grease, the kind of aroma that clung to uniforms and jackets long after people left. It was a small-town spot, 4 booths by the window, a counter with old swivel stools, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked properly in years. Most days, it was filled with a mix of truck drivers, families passing through, and a steady stream of young men in flight suits from the nearby Air Force Base. To them, it was just a cheap place for eggs and pancakes before heading back to the hangars. Behind the counter moved a woman who seemed as much a fixture of the diner as the squeaky stools. Her name was Claire, though few ever used it. Most simply called her Miss or Ma'am when asking for refills. She wore the same pale blue apron every shift, her brown hair tied back in a loose bun, and a pen tucked behind her ear. She didn't chatter much, didn't try to charm customers for tips. She simply worked efficiently, quietly, almost invisibly. But invisibility was exactly what she wanted. To the truck drivers, she was just a tired waitress with kind eyes. To the pilots, she was the one who slid their plates across the counter before they rushed off to fly $150 million jets. Nobody asked where she came from, and nobody wondered where she went when her shift ended. That was how she preferred it. A simple life. A life where no one looked too closely. Yet sometimes, when the young aviators swaggered in after a long day, she caught herself watching them. Not for their looks or their laughter, but for the weight they carried on their shoulders. She recognized it. She had once carried it too. There were moments, late at night, when the diner emptied and silence filled the booths, when memories crept in like unwelcome guests. Memories of radios crackling in her ear, of coded messages whispered through static, of voices of pilots calling her name, not Claire, but another name, a sharper name, Falcon. She shook those memories off. They belonged to another life, a life she had buried years ago. Now she poured coffee, wiped down tables, and counted tips at the end of each shift. Ordinary tasks for an ordinary life. But the truth was, Claire had never been ordinary. The diner's bell chimed one Tuesday afternoon as a group of flight trainees walked in, their laughter filling the room. Claire greeted them with a polite nod, her expression neutral. They joked with each other, arguing about maneuvers, complaining about instructors, full of the invincible energy of men who believed the sky belonged to them. She listened in silence while refilling their cups, her face unreadable. Inside, however, there was a flicker of something else, nostalgia, regret, a whisper of the world she had left behind. One of the boys, no older than 22, leaned back in his stool and asked her casually, "So, ma'am, you ever been up in one of these Raptors? You know, the F-22s? The table burst into laughter at the thought of a waitress riding in a fighter jet. Claire only smiled faintly. "No," she said softly, pouring more coffee. "But I've heard they're beautiful in the sky." Her tone carried a weight none of them noticed. She wasn't speaking from curiosity. She was speaking from memory. She had heard them roar across deserts, streak across clouds, and vanish into the night during missions that never made the news. She had heard their pilots breathe heavy under G-forces, had heard them whisper her code name in tense moments when silence could mean death. Falcon. But here, in this diner, she was no longer Falcon. She was Claire. Just Claire. After the boys left, she sat in the quiet corner booth with her coffee, staring out the window at the airbase lights in the distance. The base was close enough that the sound of Raptors taking off sometimes rattled the diner's windows. Each time she felt her pulse quicken. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It was recognition. Like hearing an old song you once knew by heart but could no longer sing. Claire's decision to disappear from that world hadn't come easily. Years ago, she had walked away from the only life she knew. Some said she retired. Others believed she was dead. The truth was more complicated. She had vanished because she had to. Because secret's hers, and the nations demanded it. And so she built a new life from nothing. A waitress in a nowhere town. A woman whose greatest thrill was fixing a jukebox that hadn't worked in a decade. She convinced herself that it was enough. That normalcy was its own kind of freedom. But sometimes, when she lay awake at night, listening to the distant roar of raptors training in the sky, she wondered, had she truly escaped her past, or was it only waiting for the right moment to find her again? That moment came on an ordinary day, as ordinary as the rest. She finished her shift, tied her apron neatly in the back, and walked out into the evening air. A flight was scheduled the next morning, a short domestic trip she had planned for weeks. She told no one. She told no one anything. That was the rule she lived by. As she packed her small overnight bag, she didn't know that fate was already aligning. She didn't know that two men in flight suits, pilots of the very Raptors she listened to every night, would soon be on the same plane. She didn't know that a single word, spoken through an intercom, would unravel the life she had carefully built. She didn't know that the world hadn't forgotten Falcon. And Falcon's story was about to begin again in seat 7F. The morning sun cast golden streaks across the runway as Claire stepped into the airport terminal, her small carry-on bag slung over her shoulder. She wasn't one to travel often. Her life was too quiet for that, but every now and then, she allowed herself the indulgence of disappearing into the clouds for a while. Today was one of those days. She had booked the flight weeks in advance. No special destination. Just a short trip across the states. A break from routine. She told herself it was nothing, just a vacation. But deep inside, she always found excuses to fly. The hum of an aircraft, the vibration of the engines, the way the world disappeared into blue skies, it was a feeling she could never abandon entirely. At the boarding gate, she blended in like everyone else. Jeans, sweater, no makeup, hair tied back. If anyone noticed her, they would think she was just another passenger in the endless river of travelers. She liked it that way. Anonymity was her shield. When her boarding group was called, she moved silently toward the gate, handing over her ticket with a polite nod. Seat 7F, the agent said cheerfully, handing it back. She slipped inside the narrow jet bridge, heart calm, step steady. It was supposed to be just another uneventful flight. The cabin was buzzing with the usual chaos of boarding. A family wrestled with a stroller, a businessman argued quietly over the phone, and a young couple tried to fit too many bags into the overhead bin. Claire moved past them, weaving her way down the aisle until she found her seat, a window seat, on the right side of the plane. She placed her bag carefully in the overhead compartment, slid into the chair, and pulled out her battered paperback novel. Seat 7F, just where she wanted to be. Out of the way, near the window, with no one to notice her. As passengers filed in, she barely glanced up. She didn't notice the two men in uniform until they passed her row. They wore the distinct green flight suits of Air Force pilots, patches stitched neatly onto their shoulders. Their posture, their stride, their quiet confidence, it was unmistakable. F-22 Raptor pilots. For a fleeting second, Claire's chest tightened. She kept her eyes fixed on her book, pretending not to notice them. They, in turn, moved past without paying her any attention. Or so she thought. The two men found seats a few rows ahead, one by the window, the other in the aisle. They spoke in low tones, relaxed but alert in that way only military men could be. Claire caught fragments of their conversation, words about training hours and maneuver drills. She closed her eyes, forcing herself not to listen. But hearing them stirred something inside her. Memories, voices from headsets. Pilots calling out maneuvers in desperate tones. A voice crackling through static. "Falcon, do you read me?" Her hands tightened around the paperback until her knuckles turned white. She took a deep breath, forcing herself back into the present. That life was gone. Those voices belonged to ghosts. The flight attendants moved briskly through the cabin, checking seat belts and stowing stray bags. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Flight 267. We'll be cruising at an altitude of 34,000 feet today. Estimated time to arrival, 1 hour and 40 minutes. Claire exhaled, relaxing into her seat. The engines roared to life. The plane rumbled down the runway, and soon the ground fell away beneath them. She leaned against the window, watching as the earth shrank into a patchwork of fields and rivers. For a while, everything felt normal. Then it happened. The intercom buzzed again, but this time, instead of the pilot, it was a flight attendant's voice, calm and professional. "Falcon, could you please press your call button? Falcon, if you're on board, we need your assistance with seating." It was nothing unusual, clearly. She was calling for a passenger named Falcon. A misplaced reservation, perhaps. But to Claire, the word landed like a thunderclap. Her breath caught. She froze in place. And she wasn't the only one. The two F-22 pilots stiffened instantly. They turned toward each other, eyes narrowing. One muttered something under his breath. Then both slowly scanned the cabin, their gazes sharp, searching. To the average passenger, it was just a name. To them, it was something else entirely. Falcon wasn't just a name. It was a call sign, a legend from deep within the Air Force. Their eyes swept the cabin and settled, almost in unison, on seat 7F, on the woman pretending to be lost in a paperback, on the woman who looked too calm, too steady, too aware. Claire could feel their eyes burning into her. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply turned the page in her book, her expression unreadable. But inside, her mind was racing. Had the airline accidentally triggered her past? Or was this something else? A coincidence? A trap? The word Falcon hadn't been spoken around her in years. And now, here it was, echoing through the cabin like a ghost, calling her back to life. The younger pilot leaned close to his companion. His jaw was tight, his voice low. "It can't be her." Falcon disappeared. She was gone. The older one didn't respond at first. His eyes stayed locked on her, studying every detail, her posture, the way she pretended to read, the faint tension in her jaw. Finally, he whispered, "Look at her. You know it's her." Claire felt her stomach twist. She didn't want this. She didn't want recognition. She wanted the sky to stay simple, just a place to disappear for a while. But fate wasn't giving her that luxury. As the plane leveled off and passengers settled in, she caught a glimpse of the two pilots standing from their seats, casually making their way down the aisle. Her pulse quickened. She gripped her book tighter, bracing herself. She had lived invisible for so long, but invisibility was over. Falcon had been found. The aisle of the plane was narrow, crowded with passengers settling into their seats, trading bags between compartments and fumbling with headphones. But for Claire, every sound blurred into background noise. She felt only the heavy weight of the two pilots' eyes as they approached row by row, their presence unmistakable. She didn't lift her gaze from the paperback resting on her lap. Her eyes moved across the lines of text, but she wasn't reading. Her mind was racing, her heartbeat steady, but loud enough she swore it could be heard. She had lived years in silence, avoiding recognition, avoiding memory. Now, in a cramped aluminum tube 30,000 feet in the air, her past was walking straight toward her. The older pilot, broad-shouldered with sharp, calculating eyes, paused as he neared her row. The younger one followed, restless energy radiating from him like static before a storm. They didn't look like ordinary passengers anymore. To anyone else, they were just Air Force officers stretching their legs. But to Claire, they were wolves circling, testing the air. She kept her face angled toward the book, as if oblivious. But her fingers tightened imperceptibly around the cover. The younger pilot leaned down slightly, as if reaching for the overhead bin. His voice, low enough only she could hear, cut through the drone of engines. Through the storm, the Falcon rises. It was a phrase older than both men combined. A squadron motto never written down, passed in whispers among those who flew missions nobody admitted existed. It wasn't a greeting, it was a key. A challenge. A test. For a long, terrible moment, Claire didn't move. She felt the words pierce her like a blade, dragging her back through time. She heard radio static in her memory, saw desert nights under moonlight, remembered the sound of raptors streaking overhead like thunder. She remembered voices panicked, strained, calling her by that name when they needed her most. Falcon, the name she had buried, the name she had sworn she'd never answer to again. And yet, the motto hung in the air, demanding an answer. She lifted her eyes slowly from the page, and for the first time, looked directly at him. Her gaze was steady, calm, the kind of look that could freeze a man in place. She saw recognition flicker in his face recognition, and awe. Her lips parted, and in a voice soft but certain, she completed the line. And in silence, she guides the storm. The younger pilot inhaled sharply, as if struck. The older one said nothing, but his eyes narrowed, confirming what his gut had told him the moment the word Falcon had echoed through the intercom. It was her. The Falcon. The air between them thickened, though no one else noticed. Around them, a toddler cried. A man adjusted his headphones. A flight attendant passed with a tray of drinks. Ordinary life marched on, oblivious to the revelation happening in row 7. The younger pilot sank into the aisle seat directly across from her, staring openly now. His voice trembled with disbelief. "We thought you were gone. No one ever saw you again?" Claire's face betrayed nothing. "That was the point," she replied quietly, her eyes returning to the book, as if the conversation didn't matter. The older pilot crossed his arms, studying her with a soldier's patience. "Falcon doesn't just disappear. Not without leaving a trace. I left nothing," she said firmly. "And that's why I'm still here." Her tone was final, but it only deepened their curiosity. Memories churned in her chest, threatening to break free. Years ago, she had been a shadow on the radio, the voice pilots trusted when missions went wrong, when ground intelligence failed, when lives hung on a thread. She had been their guide through storms of fire and chaos. She had seen maps others never saw, made calls others never dared, and saved lives in silence. She had been Falcon, and then gone. Rumors had filled the gap. Some said she died in a mission that went unreported. Others whispered she was taken, or betrayed, or forced into hiding. Few dared ask aloud. Falcon was legend, and legends didn't retire to diners. Yet here she was, sitting in 7F with a paperback, her legend hidden under an apron and a quiet smile. The younger pilot leaned closer, voice low and urgent. "Do you have any idea what your name still means? There are cadets who train on stories of you. Instructors still talk about the missions you pulled off. You're a ghost in every briefing room." Claire's expression didn't change, but her pulse quickened. Ghost. That's exactly what she had become. The older pilot finally spoke, his tone softer than before. "Why come back now? After all this time?" She closed the book and set it gently on her lap, turning her gaze toward the window where clouds drifted by. For a moment, she looked like any other passenger, lost in thought. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "I didn't come back. The world just won't let me go." Their conversation fell silent, but the connection between them had been forged. The pilots knew now, beyond doubt, that the woman in seat 7F was not a waitress, not an ordinary traveler. She was Falcon, the voice who had once guided men like them to the edge of hell. But as the silence stretched, Claire felt a familiar unease crawling through her chest. Recognition was dangerous. Recognition meant exposure, and exposure meant risk. She glanced past the pilots, scanning the cabin casually. Most passengers were relaxed reading, sleeping, chatting. But one man, 3 rows back, wasn't like the others. His eyes hadn't left her since boarding. His posture was too controlled, too intentional. He wasn't a nervous traveler, he was watching, waiting. Her instincts sharpened instantly. She knew that look. She had seen it across borders, in safe houses, in alleys where betrayal lingered like smoke. Someone was here for Falcon. And suddenly, the whisper of a call sign wasn't just recognition. It was a warning. She turned back to the pilots, her voice firm, quiet, edged with steel. "You shouldn't have said it," the younger one frowned. "Said what?" "The motto," she replied, her eyes locking onto his. "It's not just a memory. It's a signal. And if you recognized me, others might too." The older pilot followed her gaze toward the suspicious passenger. His jaw clenched. In an instant, he understood. The younger one shifted uncomfortably, his hand instinctively brushing against his seatbelt buckle as if preparing for turbulence. But this wasn't turbulence. This was a storm. The Falcon's storm. And it had only just begun. The plane hummed steadily at 34,000 feet, its engines a constant lull that masked the storm building inside Claire's chest. She sat back in her seat, the paperback forgotten, her eyes fixed on the endless stretch of sky beyond the window. Clouds drifted below like islands in a sea, but she wasn't seeing them. She was seeing deserts, mountains, runways lit only by red lamps at night. She was seeing faces, some alive, some not, and hearing voices through static that would never fade. The 2 pilots sat close now, quietly guarding her space, though to other passengers it looked like nothing more than a polite chat. They didn't press her for more words, not yet. They understood the weight of what they'd stumbled into. The legend was real, and legends required patience. But Claire knew silence wouldn't hold forever. Sooner or later, one of them would ask. And when they did, she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. Her mind drifted back to the beginning, unbidden but unstoppable. She had never planned to be Falcon. She hadn't dreamed of skies as a child, nor sought the adrenaline of jets tearing through the sound barrier. Her entry into the Air Force had been quieter, grounded in languages, codes, analysis. She was trained to see patterns others missed, to hear what others ignored. In the beginning, she had been just another intelligence officer in a sea of uniforms. Until one night. It was supposed to be routine monitoring comms during a training exercise overseas. But the training went wrong. A young pilot became disoriented in a sandstorm, radioing frantic calls as his instruments spun lies. Claire, sitting thousands of miles away with only a headset and a map, heard the panic in his voice. Others hesitated, buried in procedure. She didn't. Her voice cut through the chaos, steady, clear, giving him bearings, guiding him step by step. She spoke not as an analyst, but as if she were in the cockpit herself. And when he broke through the storm and landed safely, he told everyone the same thing. I had an angel in my ear. Word spread. The nameless analyst had saved him. But she didn't stay nameless for long. Pilots began calling her Falcon sharp-eyed, unflinching, able to soar above the storm while guiding them through it. At first, she hated the nickname. But as missions grew more dangerous, as her voice became the thread pilots clung to, Falcon became more than a call sign. It became a shield, a persona, a legend. The missions blurred together after that. Some she could talk about. Most she couldn't. She was there during blackouts when radar failed. She was there when flights skirted hostile borders. She was there when silence stretched too long and commanders feared the worst. And always, always, her voice carried calm where there was none. She remembered one night in particular, the mission that cemented Falcon as something more than myth. A squadron deep in foreign territory, engines screaming at max thrust, missiles already locked on them. Communications jammed. Panic everywhere. She had found a back channel no one else thought to use, guiding them like a lighthouse through chaos. When the squadron returned, battered but alive, the commander said quietly, "Falcon doesn't just guide us. She saves us." From then on, her voice carried weight even generals respected. But weight came with cost. Falcon was never meant to be seen. She operated in shadows, her presence known only through headsets and briefings. But the more she helped, the more attention she drew. Not from the public, not from her country, but from enemies who wanted her silenced. There were rumors of foreign agents searching for her identity. Intercepted chatter spoke of a ghost bird who crippled their operations, who made their skies unsafe. They wanted her captured. Or worse. One night, after a mission that went too far, too close to a border, no one admitted they crossed, she received a warning. Not from her superiors. Not from allies. From herself. She had seen the signs. Her name whispered in places it didn't belong. Her work traced too close to the truth. She knew what came next. So she vanished. One day, Falcon was on the coms, saving lives. The next, she was gone. Files sealed. Records erased. To the world, she had simply disappeared. Some mourned. Some assumed the worst. But only she knew the truth. She had chosen to live. Back in seat 7F, Claire shifted slightly, her eyes flicking to the aisle, where the suspicious passenger still sat 3 rows back. He pretended to read a newspaper, but his gaze was too sharp, too deliberate. The older pilot noticed her glance and followed it, his jaw tightening. He said nothing, but his hand flexed against the armrest, muscles taut. The younger one, still too green to hide his emotions, whispered, "Who is he?" Claire didn't answer. Instead, she let the question hang, her thoughts spiraling back to all the times she had seen men like him. Men trained not to be noticed. Men sent not for who she was pretending to be, but for who she really was. Falcon. She thought about the years she had spent hiding. The apron, the coffee pots, the jukebox that never worked. She had built that life carefully, every detail designed to erase who she had been. She convinced herself she was content. But now, sitting between 2 raptors and under the watchful eye of a stranger who knew too much, she realized something with startling clarity. She hadn't escaped her past. She had only delayed it. The world hadn't forgotten Falcon, and neither had her enemies. The younger pilot leaned closer, his voice low, reverent, desperate. "Why did you leave? Why walk away from all of it?" Her eyes stayed on the window, the sky stretching endlessly beyond. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but edged with steel. Because sometimes the greatest risk isn't dying in the sky. It's surviving on the ground. The words silenced him. He didn't understand, not fully. How could he? To him, the sky was glory, honor, purpose. To her, it was ghosts. For a long time, no one spoke. The hum of engines filled the silence. The seatbelt light blinked softly above, and the suspicious man turned another page of his newspaper without ever reading it. Finally, Claire looked back at the 2 pilots, her eyes sharp, unblinking. "You wanted to know why Falcon disappeared," she said. "Now you know." But what you don't understand is this Falcon can't come back. Not without consequences. The older pilot met her gaze evenly. Maybe, but consequences or not, it looks like the world's already found you. Her jaw tightened. She hated that he was right. The shadows of her hidden past weren't shadows anymore. They were sitting on this plane, 3 rows back, waiting for the moment to strike. And Falcon would have no choice but to rise again. The engines droned softly, a steady background hum that lulled half the cabin into dozing comfort. Children slept against their parents' shoulders. Businessmen tapped lazily at laptops, and flight attendants rolled carts down the aisle with polite smiles. To everyone else, it was just another routine flight. But not in row 7. There, 3 lives intersected like fault lines beneath the earth, each second carrying the weight of things unspoken. Claire Falcon sat pressed against the window, her reflection faint in the glass, while 2 F-22 pilots kept vigil across from her, as if proximity alone might answer the questions clawing at their minds. The younger pilot could hardly contain himself. His eyes darted between her and the cabin around them, his jaw tight with restrained awe. Finally, unable to bear the silence, he leaned closer. His voice was low, reverent, almost a whisper. "Falcon, we thought you were gone." Claire turned her head slightly, enough to meet his gaze. Her eyes were calm, steady, but in their depths lived storms he could never comprehend. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply let the words hang in the air before answering. "Gone," she said softly, "but not forgotten. It seems." The younger pilot swallowed hard, as though the weight of her voice confirmed something sacred. To him, Falcon wasn't just a Cody name. It was the embodiment of stories whispered in training hangars, of legends told by instructors who spoke of a faceless guardian guiding men through fire. To sit across from her now felt unreal. The older pilot said nothing at first. He simply studied her, his eyes scanning her face for traces of the myth he had half believed. He had flown long enough to know that legends were usually exaggerations, born from fear and survival. But as he looked at her, the quiet strength in her posture, the unshaken calm in her eyes, he realized something. This wasn't exaggeration. This was the truth. A flight attendant paused at their row, offering drinks with a practiced smile. Claire declined with a polite shake of her head. The younger pilot asked for coffee, the older one for water. To the attendant, it was a meaningless transaction. To Falcon, it was a reminder appearances mattered. On the surface, they were just 3 passengers sipping drinks. But beneath the surface, recognition had shifted the balance of the flight. When the attendant moved on, silence returned. This time, the older pilot spoke, his voice steady and measured. "You don't look like the stories." Claire raised an eyebrow faintly. "And what do the stories say?" "That you were everywhere at once. That you knew the skies better than the pilots themselves. That you could see through storms, through enemy radar, through chaos. That your voice." He paused, searching for the right words. "That your voice pulled men back from the edge." Her expression didn't change, but inside, she felt a sting, half pride, half sorrow. They remembered her voice, not her face. That was how it was meant to be. "I was never meant to be seen," she said quietly. "Just heard." The younger pilot leaned forward, eager. "But you saved them. All of them. My instructor flew under you once. He said if Falcon hadn't been there, his squadron wouldn't have come back. He swore you were the reason he lived long enough to train us." Claire's fingers brushed the cover of her book, but she didn't look at it. She kept her gaze steady, her voice even. "And yet, here I am, pouring coffee in a diner." Her tone wasn't bitter. If anything, it was almost detached, like someone describing another life entirely. The pilots exchanged uneasy glances. "Why?" the younger one pressed. Why walk away from it? From all of it? Claire turned her head toward the window again, her reflection faint against the pale clouds. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let the question linger, her silence heavier than words. Finally, she said, "Because legends don't live long. And because sometimes the greatest service you can give is to vanish before the world eats you alive." Her voice was low, but the words carried weight. The younger pilot opened his mouth to protest, but the older one raised a hand, silencing him. His eyes remained on her, unwavering. "You may have disappeared," he said, "but make no mistake, your name never did. Falcon became more than a voice. You became a myth. And myths don't die." Claire turned her head back toward him, meeting his gaze. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, not pride, but exhaustion. "Then the myth needs to stay dead," she said firmly. For everyone's sake. The finality in her tone silenced them both. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The cabin settled into its mid-flight rhythm. The faint clink of glasses, the murmur of conversations, the occasional cough or laugh. But beneath it all, Claire's senses stayed sharp. She could feel the weight of recognition pressing closer, not just from the men beside her, but from someone else, the stranger 3 rows back, still pretending to read his newspaper. She knew the type. His stillness was too deliberate, his patience too calculated. He hadn't spoken a word since takeoff, but his silence wasn't passive, it was observant. She had felt his eyes before the pilots ever spoke to her. And she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that he wasn't here by chance. The recognition of the pilots had been accidental. His was intentional. The younger pilot followed her gaze and frowned. "What is it?" he asked softly. Claire didn't answer right away. Her eyes lingered on the man, memorizing the set of his shoulders, the subtle way his hands rested near his lap, ready to move. She'd seen too many like him before, across borders and war zones. Agents, hunters, men trained to find ghosts. Finally, she leaned back in her seat, her voice barely above a whisper. "Silence," she said. "That's how recognition works. Not in shouts. Not in applause. It starts in silence. The moment someone sees you for who you really are, everything changes." The younger pilot frowned, confused. The older one, however, understood. His eyes hardened as he followed her glance toward the stranger. "You're saying he knows." "I'm saying he's here for me," Claire replied, her tone flat. "And if he knows, then others do too." The realization settled over them like a shadow. Recognition was no longer awe. It was danger. The younger pilot shifted in his seat, uneasy. "So what do we do?" Claire's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Not amusement, but resolve. "We stay quiet. We wait. And if he makes a move?" She paused, her eyes returning to the clouds outside. "Then Falcon rises again." The older pilot nodded slightly, already calculating, already preparing. The younger one exhaled, nerves visible in his restless hands. Around them, the cabin remained oblivious, passengers lulled into the illusion of safety. But in row 7, recognition had turned the flight into something else entirely. A battleground waiting to ignite. Claire closed her eyes briefly, shutting out the noise, the faces, the cabin. She thought of the past, of voices calling her name through static, of storms she had guided men through. She thought of the diner, the simple life she had built to stay hidden. And she thought of the stranger 3 rows back, waiting. Recognition was a double-edged sword. To the pilots, it meant awe. To her enemies, it meant opportunity. And to Claire Falcon, it meant one thing only. The storm she had outrun for years had finally caught her. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendants prepared for the evening meal service. A hush fell over the passengers, the kind that came once everyone had settled into the rhythm of flight reading, dozing or staring idly at the seatback screens. To most, it was just another leg of travel. But not in row 7. Claire sat perfectly still, her book resting closed on her lap. The hum of the engines filled her ears, but beneath it, she listened for subtler sounds. The shift of footsteps in the aisle, the scrape of fabric as someone adjusted their seat, the soft rustle of a newspaper being folded a little too neatly. Her eyes flicked, almost imperceptibly, to the man 3 rows back. He hadn't moved much since takeoff. He hadn't slept. He hadn't spoken. And yet, in the silence of his stillness, he had spoken volumes. She had seen his kind before. Operatives who lived in shadows, their bodies trained to mimic the ordinary, while their eyes betrayed their purpose. They weren't here to sightsee. They weren't here by chance. They were here for her. The younger pilot finally leaned in, his voice a whisper almost lost in the engine's drone. He hasn't looked away from us in an hour. Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. That's because he isn't watching you. He's watching me. The older pilot's eyes were steady, his posture deceptively casual. But his fingers drummed a silent rhythm on the armrest, a habit Claire recognized immediately. Pilots under stress did the same thing in the cockpit. A small tell of nerves under discipline. He spoke without turning his head. "How sure are you?" Claire exhaled softly, as though steadying herself. "Sure enough to bet my life." The drink cart rattled closer, the clink of glasses breaking the quiet tension. Passengers smiled politely as flight attendants offered trays of meals wrapped in foil. The stranger accepted one with a nod, peeled back the cover, and stirred the contents with a plastic fork. To anyone else, he was just another hungry traveler. To Claire, the measured calm of his movements betrayed him. Even his eating was deliberate, calculated to blend in, to vanish into the background while his mind stayed razor sharp. She looked away before he could feel her eyes. That was another rule she'd learned in the field. Never give them confirmation. The younger pilot shifted again, restless. His hand brushed the seatback pocket, where the safety card lay tucked beside a motion sickness bag. His voice was low, tight with unease. "If he makes a move, what do we do? We're unarmed. We can't exactly eject at 30,000 feet. The older pilot gave him a warning look, the kind that silenced cadets in training. But Claire answered instead, her voice calm and steady. "You do nothing," she said. "This isn't your fight," the younger pilot bristled. "Nothing? He's here for you. That means we're already in it." Claire's gaze shifted to him, sharp as a blade. "If you move too soon, you make things worse. If you make him feel seen, he'll act. Right now, he's waiting, calculating, and that silence is the only thing keeping this cabin safe." The young pilot swallowed hard, but he nodded. He understood, even if his nerves screamed otherwise. For the next half hour, the flight carried on like any other. Passengers unwrapped meals, flight attendants cleared trays, the cabin lights dimmed again. A baby cried briefly, then fell silent. And still, the stranger sat, watching, waiting. Every so often, Claire's eyes slid to the reflection in the window. From that angle, she could see him without turning. His posture hadn't changed. Neither had his gaze. Recognition. Silent, dangerous recognition. Her mind drifted back, unbidden, to the years she'd spent listening to voices through static. Pilots under fire. Squadrons on the edge of disaster. Her strength had never been her hands or her speed. It was her calm. Her ability to remain steady when storms raged around her. That calm was all she had now. The younger pilot shifted again, his nerves fraying. Claire reached out, placing her hand briefly over his. The touch was light, almost absent, but the message was clear. Stay steady. His breathing slowed. Just slightly. Suddenly, The stranger moved. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden leap, no weapon drawn. He simply folded his tray table back up and stood, stretching as though preparing to walk the aisle. But Claire's eyes tracked every detail. The way his shoulders stayed tight, the way his hand brushed the inside of his jacket, the way his eyes flicked not around the cabin, but directly at her. Her body tensed, but she forced herself not to react. Reaction was what he wanted. The stranger turned, stepping casually into the aisle. He walked slowly, his steps unhurried, as though he were heading toward the restroom at the rear of the plane. Passengers barely noticed. A few glanced up, then returned to their meals or books. But Claire knew. She always knew. He wasn't going to the restroom. He was circling, testing, measuring the space between them. The older pilot's voice was barely audible. "He's moving. I see him," Claire murmured. The younger pilot tensed. "Should we?" "No." Her tone was sharp, decisive. "Not yet." They watched as the man passed row after row, his expression unreadable. When he reached the rear of the plane, he paused briefly, glancing toward the lavatory. Then, as though changing his mind, he turned and began walking back, this time on the opposite aisle. His eyes swept the cabin once, casual, uninterested. But Claire saw the truth in the microseconds. His gaze had locked on every exit, every attendant, every potential obstacle. He was mapping the battlefield. And when his eyes flicked toward row 7 again, just for a heartbeat, Claire felt it deep in her chest. This wasn't random. This was reconnaissance. When he returned to his seat, folding himself back into place with deliberate calm, the tension in row 7 didn't ease. If anything, it deepened. Because now Claire knew what came next. "He's confirming," she said softly. "Confirming what?" The younger pilot whispered. "That I'm who he thinks I am? And when he's sure?" Her voice trailed off, her eyes hardening. "He'll act." The younger pilot's face paled. "On a commercial flight? With all these people?" Claire's eyes stayed on the stranger. "If he's here, it means they think the risk is worth it." Silence settled over them again, heavy and suffocating. The cabin lights dimmed further as passengers began to drift into sleep. The hum of the engines became a lullaby for most. But for Claire, it was the drumbeat of a countdown. She knew this rhythm. She had lived it before, though never in a place so fragile, so full of innocence. Recognition was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a knife pressing against her back, waiting for the moment to strike. The younger pilot clenched his fists, whispering fiercely, "We can't just sit here and wait." Claire turned her head toward him, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "Yes," she said, "we can. Because if Falcon moves too soon, everyone on this plane pays the price." Her words silenced him, though the fear in his eyes didn't fade. The older pilot leaned closer, his voice grim. "And if he moves first?" Claire's gaze locked on the stranger, her expression unreadable. "Then Falcon comes back," she said. "And this time, she won't be just a voice in the storm." The cabin had grown quiet. Too quiet. Most passengers had sunk into half-sleep, lulled by the steady drone of engines and the dim glow of overhead lights. A baby's soft whimper broke the silence for a moment, then faded. Flight attendants whispered near the galley, collecting trays, their movements calm and ordinary. But in row 7, nothing was ordinary. Claire Falcon sat utterly still, every muscle coiled, every breath measured. Her eyes stayed locked on the man 3 rows back, the one who had circled the cabin under the guise of stretching his legs. He hadn't moved again since returning to his seat. But stillness didn't mean safety. Stillness meant preparation. The older pilot leaned slightly toward her, his voice a gravel, quiet murmur. "He's waiting for something." Claire didn't look away from the stranger. "They always are, The younger pilot shifted nervously. His hand tapped against his knee, restless energy threatening to betray him. He tried to speak, then stopped, as though realizing that any word too loud could break the fragile illusion of normalcy surrounding them. It happened quickly. Too quickly for the average passenger to notice. The man reached down as though to adjust his bag beneath the seat. When he straightened, his posture had changed, shoulders set, eyes sharper, focus narrowed. His right hand brushed the inside of his jacket, subtle but deliberate. Claire's blood went cold. She knew that motion. Weapon draw. She didn't think. Instinct moved her. Her voice cut through the silence, firm but low enough not to alarm the entire cabin. Down! Both pilots obeyed instantly, dropping lower in their seats. A heartbeat later, the stranger stood, stepping into the aisle, his jacket shifting in a way that revealed the glint of something metallic. Passengers gasped. One woman shrieked. The calm of the cabin shattered like glass. The stranger didn't brandish the weapon openly, not yet. He kept it angled close to his body, shielded from most eyes by the aisle seat in front of him. But Falcon saw it. She saw everything. Her mind calculated in rapid bursts distance to target, angle of approach, reaction time. She counted the rows between them, the number of bystanders in the line of fire, the narrow width of the aisle. Too many innocents. Too much risk. She had one chance. The younger pilot whispered harshly, "What do we do?" Claire's eyes never left the stranger. Her voice was ice. "We buy time." The man stepped forward, slow and deliberate, scanning the cabin as passengers cowered in their seats. His eyes landed on her. Recognition flared, not curiosity, not suspicion, but certainty. He knew. Falcon had been found. She rose from her seat with controlled calm, ignoring the pilot's sharp intake of breath. To the other passengers, it might have looked like she was panicked, standing in fear. But her movements were measured, precise, calculated to draw his full attention. And it worked. The stranger's gaze locked on her, narrowing. His hand pressed tighter against the inside of his jacket. Claire raised her hands slightly, palms open, her voice carrying just enough for him to hear. "There's no need for this." "Not here." The man's lips twitched into the faintest shadow of a smile. His reply was low, almost conversational, but laced with menace. "You disappeared. Hard to find a ghost. But ghosts always leave shadows." Her jaw tightened. He wasn't guessing. He was certain. Passengers shifted uneasily, whispers spreading in ripples. A child began crying. A man fumbled for the call button, panic rising. Flight attendants froze at the galley, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. The pilot stayed low but tense, eyes flicking between Falcon and the armed stranger. "Falcon," the older pilot whispered. "You can't." "I can," she said sharply. "And I will." The stranger stepped closer, each movement deliberate, rehearsed. His eyes never left hers. "You're coming with me," he said softly, almost casually, as though they were discussing dinner plans. "Quietly, or this cabin becomes a tomb." Passengers gasped at his words, though most hadn't yet seen the weapon hidden at his side. The fear was instinctive, spreading like wildfire. Claire tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, measured. "You won't fire. Not here. Too many witnesses. Too many cameras." His smile deepened, but it wasn't warm. "You think I care about cameras?" His hand shifted. Metal glinted. Time slowed. Claire saw everything, the flicker of light on steel, the widening eyes of the passengers nearest him, the way the pilots tensed, ready to act despite being unarmed. She felt the weight of the cabin's fear, pressing down like gravity. And in that instant, Falcon returned. Not the waitress. Not the ghost. Falcon. Her voice snapped like thunder. Now. She moved first. Her hand shot forward, grabbing the younger pilot's untouched coffee cup from the tray. With practiced precision, she flung its contents toward the stranger's face. The scalding liquid arced through the air, catching him off guard. He recoiled, cursing, his weapon slipping just enough out of alignment. Claire lunged. The narrow aisle became a battlefield. She slammed her shoulder into him, forcing the weapon hand upward toward the ceiling. A muffled shot rang out, silenced but audible enough to send passengers into full-blown panic. Screams erupted. People ducked, covered their heads, scrambled against seatbacks. The older pilot sprang from his seat, grabbing the man's arm, twisting with all the force of years spent handling controls under G-forces. The younger pilot followed, adrenaline overriding hesitation, tackling the man's torso. Together, they drove him against the seats, the weapon clattering against the floor. Chaos consumed the cabin. Flight attendants shouted for calm. Passengers cried and shouted. Oxygen masks rattled in their compartments, though none deployed. The stranger thrashed, trained strength, keeping him dangerously close to breaking free. Claire was in the center of it all, her body moving with memory as much as instinct. She pinned his wrist, slammed his elbow against the armrest, forced leverage until his grip weakened. The older pilot seized the weapon, kicking it down the aisle toward the galley, where a flight attendant quickly snatched it with trembling hands. The younger pilot wrapped his arms around the man's chest, straining to hold him down as the stranger bucked violently. But Falcon's voice cut through the storm, steady and commanding. Hold him. Don't let go. And they didn't. The struggle lasted seconds, though it felt like hours. Finally, with one last wrench of force, the stranger collapsed against the seat, pinned and restrained. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes blazing with fury, but beneath it, a grudging recognition. Falcon had risen again. Passengers peeked cautiously from behind seatbacks, whispers spreading. What happened? Who is she? The flight attendants rushed forward, faces pale, voices shaky as they promised the cabin that everything was under control. It wasn't, not yet. But Claire knew control had shifted. She stood slowly, her breath steady despite the pounding in her chest. Her eyes met the stranger's, cold and unflinching. You made your mistake, she said. You thought Falcon was gone. His lips curled into a bitter smile. They'll never stop. Her jaw tightened. Neither will I. For the first time in years, she had spoken the words aloud, not as Claire, not as a waitress in a forgotten diner, but as Falcon. And the sky around them, once quiet and routine, had turned hostile. The cabin smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cordite. A haze of panic lingered in the air, though the immediate danger had passed. Passengers sat hunched in their seats, wide-eyed and whispering. Some clutched children, some prayed quietly, some simply stared at row 7, as if it had transformed into the stage of a play they had never agreed to watch. At the center of it all stood Claire Falcon, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, though her heart thundered beneath her calm exterior. The stranger was restrained now, his wrists bound with strips of torn seatbelts. The younger pilot knelt beside him, sweat dripping down his brow, while the older one stood guard, posture squared, eyes scanning every movement in the cabin. But it wasn't the stranger who held everyone's attention. It was her. The flight attendants moved cautiously, collecting the confiscated weapon and stowing it far out of reach. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling, but their voices carried authority as they reassured passengers. Everything is under control. Please remain seated. The situation is being handled, but the truth was obvious. Control didn't belong to them. It belonged to the woman in seat 7F, Falcon. Claire could feel the stares pressing against her, heavy and unrelenting. For years, she had hidden in anonymity, convinced herself that obscurity was safety. But anonymity was gone now, stripped away in seconds of chaos. She had acted, and in doing so, revealed herself. She knew what the passengers were thinking. Who is she? How did she move like that? How did she know what to do? They would tell the story after they landed, each version shifting, growing, becoming myth. Just like before, Falcon had returned, and the world had seen her. The younger pilot broke the silence first. He looked up at her with wide eyes, awe still etched across his face. "You saved us," he whispered. Claire shook her head, her voice calm but firm. "We saved ourselves, together." But he wasn't convinced. His gaze didn't waver, filled with the same reverence she had heard years ago through radios and headsets. To him, Falcon wasn't just a name. She was proof that legends could be flesh and blood. The older pilot's voice was steadier, more grounded, but no less certain. "You can't hide anymore." Those words hit harder than the struggle itself. Claire looked toward the window, the endless sweep of night sky beyond the glass. Hiding had been her shield, her sanctuary. It had allowed her to live quietly, far from the storms she once guided others through. But tonight had proven what she had refused to admit. Hiding didn't erase who she was. It only delayed the inevitable. The restrained stranger stirred, his eyes burning with quiet defiance. Even bound, even defeated, he carried an unsettling calm. His lips twisted into a smirk as he muttered, "This isn't over. You've painted a target on yourself again." Claire crouched down slowly, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were steady, unflinching, filled with the steel of someone who had walked through storms before. "Then let them come," she said softly. "I've been running long enough." The man's smirk faltered, just slightly. Falcon's voice carried no fear, only resolve. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Passengers leaned closer, whispering her words to one another, already weaving them into the narrative that would spread far beyond this flight. A legend reborn in the sky. Claire stood again, her body calm but her mind racing. She knew the truth. This was no longer about a single stranger on a plane. This was the signal flare. Whoever had sent him would know he had failed. And they would send more. Her life as Claire, the waitress in a quiet diner, was gone. Only Falcon remained. The pilots exchanged a look, unspoken understanding passing between them. Then the older one stepped forward, his voice firm. "When we land, you won't be alone. Whatever comes next, you'll have allies. You've earned more than silence. You've earned a place with us." The younger one nodded eagerly. "You belong in the sky." "Always did." Claire looked at them, her lips curving into the faintest shadow of a smile. For years, she had convinced herself that her voice was her only power, that her place had always been unseen, unheard except through static. But tonight had reminded her of something she had buried deep. Falcon wasn't just a voice. Falcon was a force. Hours later, the plane descended through layers of cloud, the lights of the city below flickering like constellations. Passengers pressed against windows, eager to return to solid ground, eager to leave behind the fear that had stolen their calm. But for Claire, the descent was more than a journey home. It was a reckoning. She thought of the years she had spent erasing herself, pouring coffee and pretending the skies didn't call her name. She thought of the pilots who still carried her legend like a torch, of the strangers who whispered Falcon's name with reverence. And she thought of the man restrained at the back of the cabin, a reminder that shadows would always follow her. When the wheels touched the runway and the cabin erupted into relieved applause, she didn't join. She sat quietly, eyes closed, a calm resolve settling in her chest. Falcon had risen again. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers fumbled for phones, already drafting stories they would tell for years, about the mysterious woman in row 7, the one who stood against danger without fear. Some would exaggerate. Some would forget details. But the heart of the story would endure. And legends, Claire knew, had a way of living forever. When the cabin doors finally opened, uniformed authorities boarded swiftly, taking custody of the restrained man. He didn't resist. He only looked back at Claire with that same smirk, a silent promise that the storm was far from over. She met his gaze without flinching. No more running. As the authorities led him away, the younger pilot turned to her. What now? Claire rose slowly, the weight of her decision heavy but undeniable. She adjusted her jacket, squared her shoulders, and looked down the aisle as though the narrow space stretched into the vast sky itself. Now, she said quietly, Falcon flies again. Passengers would remember that line. They would carry it with them, embellish it, retell it in hushed voices. And somewhere, in hidden rooms where enemies whispered, the words would echo with equal weight. Falcon was back, and the world would never be the same.